Good morning, everyone, and Shabbat Shalom. Myrna, are you there? I don't actually see you on my screen.
I am.
Wonderful. Now I see you. Hello. Good morning. Shabbat
Hi,
Shalom.
good morning. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you for doing this. Before we get started, I do want to recommend that everyone at some point when this is over, take a look at the wonderful video with music and clever lyrics, which I think you composed, correct, Myrna?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But
So well
let
done.
me acknowledge Candor and Ebb, since they were doing, I forgot to do that on me.
I heard a little Tom Lehrer in there as well. You and I are old enough to know who that is.
Yes, for sure.
So I guess the best place to start is at the beginning. You grew up in Brooklyn. Tell us about your family, your childhood a little bit.
Okay, my parents were both immigrants. They came in the 1920, between 20 and 21. And they were both refugees during World War I in Europe. My father's situation was somewhat better because his father was in the Austrian-Hungary Empire, in the Austrian-Hungary Army. And so they had a regular stipend. My mother's father was in the US. And when the war broke out, they were not getting any money, they were not getting any more remittances. Plus, the invading Russian army invaded their village and took the Jews captive for ransom. They said they would marching them to the front. And they were with the army for probably a total of about 2 weeks till they came to a town called Chortkov, which had a large and fairly wealthy Hasidic dynasty based there. And the community ransomed the Jews. They paid the Russian army for the Jews and they took them in. And eventually my mother went to work for one of the bakers in town. Not my mother, sorry, my grandmother went to work. And that's how they survived the war. And after the war, they were able to connect with my grandfather, and then they came to the States. So I grew up with those stories, and they really are a very significant part of my life. They really shaped me in terms of an appreciation for immigration and how hard it is to do it, and how important it is for the lives of the people who are immigrating. And as I say, these are the stories that I grew up on. Okay, so I grew up in Brooklyn. My father had a hardware store that was, as I was thinking about it, it was more like a family farm since we all worked. It was a small store and we all worked on it. My parents and my mother worked there on Saturdays, and my brothers, as they grew older, worked there as well and made deliveries. So it was, and I did the bills once a month. For his charge customers, and it was a multi-ethnic neighborhood, not a fancy neighborhood at all, but it was very colorful and very interesting, and I loved living in a city and loved being in a multi-ethnic neighborhood, although it had some challenges as well. But overall, it was really a great experience.
Did you go to public school?
I went to public school, and then I went to Brooklyn College, which at that time was really it probably still is, a first-rate academic institution, not only because of its faculty, but because of its students. They were hardworking, striving, and ambitious students. So it really was a challenging kind of environment, and I loved it. I was also very active in Young Judea, and I went to Israel in 1953 as part of a Young Judea summer course. And then I led a Young Judea group in my local synagogue for a couple of years. But that was a big part of my life, primarily in high school. In college, not as much. I am the middle child of I have two brothers, one older and one younger, but fortunately I'm the only girl, so that came with some privileges.
Yes, it does.
Let's see, what else?
Well, let me ask you about college, because you're the third woman we've interviewed in this series, all three of whom went to college. And if my math is right, this is still the mid-50s?
Yeah, mid-50s.
Pre Betty Friedan, pre the feminist movement. Were you unusual among your peers?
No. Well, by the time when I was 12, my family moved into the area of Brooklyn called Flatbush. And so my peers were different at that point, and most of them did go on to college. It was kind of an expectation. And I never thought about not going to college. It just was sort of the thing you did and expected of me.
Interesting. And what were your aspirations when you went off to college?
Well, while I was in college, I was sort of looking at both social work and the more academic sociology part. And I actually took a year's course of social work, and I decided that I really was more challenged by some of the academic studies, academic approaches to looking at societies. And so I ended up majoring in sociology with a minor in urban studies. And then I went on, I married right after college. In fact, I accelerated my college program. I went to a double summer school session, and I graduated college in 3.5 years. So I was young when I got married.
And then you wrote in your bio, you went to Israel with your husband for.
After graduate school, we both did graduate work. I was at Brown for 2 years, and he was at MIT. And when our graduate programs were finished, we went to Israel.
And you wrote that our time in Israel was the most intense and interesting 18 months of our life. Why?
It was. Well, for one thing, we arrived in Israel in 1960, late in 1960. And it was a 12-year-old country. It had the challenges of absorbing hundreds of thousands of immigrants. It was a new country, and it had economic problems. It was a poor country too, had economic problems. So there was a mission though, there was a purpose, and people felt it. And I think I felt it also, just being there and meeting people and eventually going to work there. I went to the Ulpan, which is an intensive language program. I went 6 days a week, 4 hours a day, 24 hours a week for 5 months. So that was really my way of not only learning to speak the language, but sort of meeting other people who had emigrated to Israel. So in my Ulpan class, there were about people from 8 or 9 different countries. I actually wrote a little memoir piece about the Ulpan. So if anyone is interested in, just let me know, and I'd be glad to send it to you. So that was and I had an amazing teacher. She was someone from the second Aliyah, and I'm sorry. She was someone from the second Aliyah, and she had come over from Russia in about the 1920s. And so she shared with us all of her experiences as a pioneer in Israel. So I really felt that I became I became quite infused. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
That I really became sort of very connected to the
Just turn it
off. All the devices are going off, yeah. And everyone in the class had a story.
Hello?
sorry. Everyone in the class had a story to tell about, they came from many different countries, and it was really a very sort of meaningful experience. And another thing is that when you're living in another country, everything is new. You have so much to learn. Each day is kind of an adventure, you know, taking the bus, going to the supermarket, buying food. Just everyday life there was something that you learned almost every day.
Did you contemplate staying?
Well, I would have stayed longer, because by the time we left after 18 months, I felt really deeply enmeshed in the country. But my husband was an only child, and for a variety of reasons, he felt that he needed to return. But I don't know whether I would have stayed permanently, but I certainly was prepared to stay longer.
So when you came back, you worked on the anti-poverty programs, the Great Society, which of course is very timely, what we're dealing with now. Tell us a little bit about that work and what you felt was accomplished during that time.
Well, when I came back, I went to work for an organization called Washington Action for Youth. This was the Kennedy administration. We returned in '62. And that was the middle of the Kennedy administration. And Bobby Kennedy was Attorney General, and he was promoting a juvenile anti-delinquency program, and was very instrumental in having a sort of a pilot program developed in DC. In fact, he came when we opened the program. He came to inaugurate it, and I remember it was the only big press conference I've ever been at, and he announced the opening of the program. So that was actually the precursor of the poverty program, which United Planning Organization, which was the local poverty program in DC. Our work in the beginning was mainly sort of planning what the program would be, and also we ran sort of youth training programs, and also we started the first summer employment program for youth. It's now, and I remember in particular, because I was very pregnant, running around in August, making sure that everything was working well. And so that program has continued in DC, and I think in other places as well, providing summer jobs for youth. Then my first child was born, and I did some teaching, sort of part-time for a while. I think one of the more interesting things in terms of teaching was Washington Technical Institute. I don't even know whether it still exists, but it was created to work with, to provide technical education, and also to support DC government. And one of the things they were interested in was in providing their staff at the juvenile facility with Cedar Knolls, I think, some better understanding of where children who were incarcerated, where they came from, what was their background. And so I developed a course on the culture of poverty, which later on I also taught at Howard. In fact, it was the 60s, and I've lost my train of thought. It was the 60s, and the students at Howard were looking for more relevant programs. And it's a little ironic that a white woman developed the program, and after teaching it for a year, I said to them, here's the curriculum, here's everything I did, the books and such, and I really think you should find a Black person to teach it. I don't know whether they did, but I felt, the students appropriately challenged me. What do you know about it? I said, well, I read and I study, but it was an interesting time.
Does your experience working with African Americans and working on a poverty program, given that, do you have any thoughts on how people can proceed in this current moment so that we don't have to start all over again 50 years from now?
Well, there are some very good ideas about reforming of police that are being put out by the protest organizations and the organizations supporting the protest. You know, it's both heartening and a little frustrating to realize we've been at this for 50 years or so, and we've made progress, but we haven't made enough. We haven't moved far enough, fast enough, and I hope maybe I am very much struck by, and a number of commentators have made this observation, so I'm very much struck by the contrast to the riots of the 60s, where there's a large percentage of whites who are supporting the protests. And I think that's a real sea change, and it's not an original observation. I think it's a real sea change from the earlier riots or protests.
Yeah, that's interesting, and clearly less damage this time around than there was in Washington.
Oh yeah, it's not mainly protest rather than, yeah, and it's clear that the people who are doing the looting are not necessarily, they're not this one and the same as the protesters for the most part.
Well, let's move ahead, because even though you had your master's degree from Brown, you decided you needed more education. Very Jewish of you. Tell us about your journey to Michigan, sort of the mid-career move.
Well, I was working in some different aspects of the poverty program, but I was also feeling that I didn't have sort of a home base. I didn't have a specific kind of professional identity. And I was I was going up to a meeting in Philadelphia, and I was on the train with a colleague of mine, and I shared that with him. And he said to me, well, you know, interesting that you tell me this, because there's a new program, a new Master's in Public Health program being developed at the University of Michigan and one other place on the West Coast, one of the University of California campuses. And the program is an on-job, on-campus program. That is, it's really designed for people who are mid-career, who are working. And the purpose of why it was developed was because the poverty program had established a number of community health centers, but what they found was that they had a lot of staff, particularly Black staff, who didn't have the, let's say, the public health background. They had other backgrounds, social work, dentists, doctors, nurses, but they didn't have what's felt to be an appropriate degree for managing community health centers. So this was a joint program developed, what was a program that OEO sort of supported, was stimulated. I'm not really sure what the relationship was, but I flew out to Michigan 4 days a month for 24 months. And I had the same number of contact hours as if I was on the campus. And it was first of all, it was great to be with other mid-career professionals. It was different than going to, I mean, I could have gone to Hopkins. There was a commute there too. And I was really intrigued by going to school with people who were working and could bring that kind of experience to the classroom. And that's what happened.
Yeah, and I want to get on to what was next, but let me just backtrack for 1 sec, because there were a couple of good questions, and thank you all. Keep the questions and suggestions coming. A couple of people asked what you think about the idea of reparations, Myrna. You don't have to worry about reading the questions. I'll keep track.
Okay. Well, someone talked about sort of reparations on a community basis. In other words, establishing programs specifically that would provide assistance. And we have some of that, but I think we need to really widely expand it. And I think that makes a lot more sense than individual reparations. And, you know, in effect, I think that's what we need to do. We need to strengthen the programs and the services to the Black and also the Latino community. I think if anything, this series of protests has really revealed the terrible underside of our country.
The protest and the virus too, right?
Yeah, both. Yes, thank you. Right.
So after Michigan, you had two sons by then? They were
I
grown,
had two sons.
growing?
Well, they were, Michigan, by the time I went to Michigan, they were youngish, but not grown.
But you were able by then to sort of launch the next chapter, which was work in international development and family planning. So tell us some about that.
By the time I worked internationally, because I went back to work, I worked in the domestic family planning program here, and then when my oldest son was already in college, and my youngest son was in high school, I did start traveling. And the first program I worked with was in Somalia, and that was a first family planning, and it wasn't even called family planning; it was called child spacing, because it was not yet accepted. And I think part of what we were trying to do was to show the need and to build support. And that's fortunately, smartly, AID makes these projects 10-year projects because it's at least that. And it was slow going, and then after 4 or 5 years, there was basically a civil war in Somalia, and everything came to a halt. We had, by that time, one of the things that we were doing was really equipping a whole sort of communications effort, and we had TVs and video cameras, and we worked hours on catalogs trying to find the right equipment. And I think about what was destroyed, and that's during that civil war, and the country has never really returned to what it once was. That was a long-term project, and we were a contract organization, and we placed staff in country, and who worked with local staff. I was sort of managing the local staff and the overall project. That was one kind of model, and then I worked on other projects, like the one in India was particularly interesting. We were working with the Indian Medical Association. India at that time was very successful in reducing births, mainly through sterilization. They were mainly a one-method country, mainly sterilization. And I think the government began to realize that you could do better if you offered more than one method. And so we had in one state, we were working with the Indian Medical Association. We did training mainly on the pill. And then they wanted, we were working with local doctors, and they wanted sort of some incentive for offering the pill. And so we looked into the logistics of having them get supplies of pills that they could mark up a little bit. So nothing, everything has a little twist to it. When the rubber hits the road, as they say. And then I worked in the Philippines, and this is not, I'm not telling this in sequence. I'm just sort of, and that was a very interesting program. Also dealing with expanding the range of methods. There we were involved. I worked at Georgetown University at that point, and there we were involved in introducing natural methods, because the Philippines is a very Catholic country, and many women used natural methods, but they didn't use it necessarily correctly. So we developed sort of a mnemonic device for them to use, so they would know when they were fertile and when they were infertile. And so I worked in the Philippines for probably 6 or 7 years before I retired. But these were long trips. I'd go out for 2-3 weeks.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, and that's the idea of limiting family size, or at least giving women the option to
The
limit
option.
family size is sort of a key to having economic security for the family and economic growth as well for the country, correct?
Yeah.
So
Absolutely. I mean, the program was really part of a larger sort of economic development, economic assistance program. I mean, that was really what it was designed to do. And for example, in the Somalia project, which was the first such project in the country, we had a component on girls' education. We also had a component that was probably one of the more easier to accept, and that was dealing with women with female circumcision. In Somalia, which was a Muslim country, about 99.8% of the women are circumcised, and it's got terrible, terrible effects on them. But that was a program that the Somali women really wanted, and we worked with the Somali Women's Democratic Organization. This is a carryover from when Somalia was Russian, under the Russian influence.
interesting.
And they were doing, and that's how it had to be done. It had to be done by Somalis, and that was one component that was really very well accepted.
So let's jump ahead again, if it's
I'm
okay.
jumping all over, but I think
No, it's fine. There's a shape to this. So tell us about your religious history a little bit and how you found your way to Adat Shalom. And
Okay.
We all know what a important role you've played in this community. So how did that all come to pass?
Okay, well, I grew up in a conservative household, but in adulthood, and I belonged to conservative synagogues, but in adulthood, it didn't fit me as well. It didn't fit me well. And when my husband and I first got to Washington, some friends that we knew from Young Judea in New York told us that they were involved in starting a Reconstructionist study group. And that was really when I was exposed to Reconstructionism. We read Mordecai Kaplan's works. We met once a month. Lil Kaplan was one of the leaders of the group. Remember Lil? Yeah. And we studied sort of Reconstructionist thinking. But some of the people from that group later formed the Chavarah at Adas Israel. And I went with them to the Chavarah. It was a great service, all self-led. We met in the library, met twice a month, and it was a wonderful community. In the beginning, when we were still small, we would have Kiddush in someone's home. And in fact, it was in my home the day that Sadat came to Israel. Wow. And nobody would eat any of the food I had put out. They were so busy watching the meeting between Sadat and Begin. So I was a member of the Chavarah, and I happened to have seen the notice that Sid put in the Jewish Week about holding high holiday services, and I think he identified it as a Reconstructionist community. And I made a mental note. And before I joined, I visited Adat Shalom a couple of times when they were in Potomac, and then when they were in on Old Georgetown Road. But it needed to be the right time for me, and so that's eventually how I got to Adat Shalom. And well, Adat Shalom was an extraordinarily welcoming and warm. It's the same community it was then, and it really. What year did I join Adat Shalom? Somewhere in the 90s. We were already in the JCC, so we were there for a couple of years after I joined. So that's the approximate time. I'd have to go back and if I could find it, if I could dig it out. So it was the mid 90s, and it was a place where they welcomed whatever you wanted to contribute. Whatever you felt you could contribute, and it was, and I feel that I was able to grow in many different ways as a member of Adat Shalom, and eventually in becoming president, which was part of the journey.
And there might be people, I'm sure there are people listening who don't know about the program that you and Rachel did. I'm going to mispronounce it, so I'm not going to say it in Hebrew.
Which is the Foundations of Learning. I think that came from I think I once made a casual comment. While I was a member of ADIS, I had been in the adult bat mitzvah program. And I think I may have made a casual comment to Rachel once about, we ought to have an adult bat mitzvah program here.
That's risky.
It's risky. Little did I know, a couple of years later, Rachel came back to me and said, well, I think we ought to, we ought to do that. Can we work together and develop it? And I want to say it was one of the most creative collaborations I've had. I would certainly rank it among the most interesting and collaborative. And we would sit, and there would be a kind of synergism. Rachel would say something, and I would say something, and then Rachel would elaborate it, and I would elaborate it. And it was just, and I think in that process, we shaped the Yesodot HaLimud program. And each year, and each time it was offered, we learned something. I mean, often what happens when you have a program, you're too ambitious. We wanted to accomplish everything. And that was the first program. But I think that the people who were in the first program survived beautifully, nevertheless. And so we had, I think totally, we probably had over 100 people in the congregation who've been through all the three classes. And
yeah, and so many of my friends in the congregation got so much out of that program. I guess I want to thank you on their behalf. And Rachel, do you want to add a thought or two on what the process was like of developing it?
Just that working with Myrna was the secret sauce to get that thing finally off the ground. And as Myrna's saying, we play with it and tweak it each time. But it was just really, it's been a gift to work with her, with you, Myrna.
Thank you. And I feel the same way. It was, you can't predict these things. People connect in ways that you just can't predict. And it was an amazingly marvelous experience. And I'm so glad I had it, and so glad that I was able to work with 3 classes.
So we're getting near the end of our time. Myrna, tell us about your recent writing experiences. You've self-published one book, and you're at work on another.
Here's a book. Can you see it? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, this is really the story about my grandparents and parents' experience coming to America. It's called From the Shtetl to the Sun Belt. And my parents ended up in Florida. They started in an Eastern European shtetl. And I essentially told the story of my grandparents, and then my mother and father separately, then as a couple and as a family. And some of the stories were things I remembered from childhood. Okay, Carol Fetter wants me to hold up the book again. Can you see it?
Yeah, a little higher.
A little higher.
There you go.
Okay. And that's my grandparents at my brother's bar mitzvah. So some of it was based on tape recordings, particularly of my sons had and my nieces had with my parents. Some of it was based on memory, and some of it was based on research. And I went online, and it was amazing the things that I discovered. Just to give you an example, my mother talked about when they were refugees in Chortkov, that they stayed in the rabbi's house. And she said it was a mansion. And I thought to myself, if you come from the shtetl, a big house is a mansion. Well, it was kind of something that bothered me. And that was actually the last thing before I was ready to publish. I decided I better check about the rabbi's house in Chortkov. Here's a picture of it. Indeed, can you see it?
Hold it up a bit higher. Oh, it was a mansion.
It was a mansion. Indeed, he was the head of the Hasidic, it was a Hasidic dynasty, and he was the head. And of course, my mother said, and he fled. So that's why his house was available. He fled, the city during the war. Well, for safety too. I'm sure his followers wanted him to be safe. And it was probably a 10-year effort, because I didn't really have a grand plan when I started. I just wanted to capture what I knew, and my brother had done a sort of genealogy more on the all of the relatives and when they came. But I focused in my work just really on my nuclear family. And what I would do is I would just write things as I did research, and it was a long-term process, because I didn't have any idea what I was going to do with it when I started. And finally, I realized I really had a lot of material, and it's time to organize it and put it together. And I really wanted, the next generation they lose so much of what the previous generation experienced. And I just felt it was too valuable to lose, and it was just an important story of our family. So that's what impelled me to and I printed enough copies to share with the immediate family. So I hope it will be something that people will look at from time to time.
And this is my last question. And actually, my connection is freezing, so I'm not hearing all of your answers. So I should say thank you to everybody and maybe drop out here. But my last question is just tell us a little about the book you're doing now. I suppose one benefit of the situation we're all in is you have some time to work on it.
I don't know whether I don't know. Again, what I am doing is I've joined a writing group, a memoir writing group, which has 2 adoptional members, Naomi Weiss and Joel Bremen. I don't think they would mind if I outed them. And I'm basically just doing short memoir pieces about different aspects of my life. There's sort of no rhyme or reason, just something pops into my head. Oh, I should write about that. I'm also taking some of the writing that I had done in the book and expanding the stories. And it's in a way, it's a very meaningful thing to do, particularly at this stage in life where I have the time, and I have a chance to sort of stand back and look at my life and what I've done. And it's less a real sort of biography. It's more sort of stories, like I wrote about being in the old pond as an example. I'm now writing about my father's hardware store. It's all quite serendipitous, and I don't know what I'm going to write about next, but usually when I need to, a topic comes into my head. And it's just been very satisfying. I think at some point maybe I will publish it and share. Some of it I have to think about, because some of it is also not so easy to share. At least, I'm a fairly private person, so I'll have to see how it all evolves. But in the meantime, it's a wonderful group, and they just getting the feedback from people who are serious writers. I mean, I wouldn't consider myself a serious writer, but people who write and know how to put a good piece of writing together. And two of the people in the group have written autobiographies, so I have some really experienced hands in the process.
Before we go, Myrna, do you want to either talk about or introduce any of your family members who are here?
I haven't had a chance to look at who's here, so let me, you know what? Let me have my family identify themselves.
Yeah,
hello, family.
I'm just going to jump in here because of our Zoom setup. I don't think they can unmute themselves and identify themselves. So I know Jonathan, your son Jonathan, is here because I saw him. I saw his name and his photo, but I don't know if anyone else.
Okay. All right. Yeah, well, I sent, this morning I sent I sent you the names, but I realized there may have been some difficulty getting them. Anyway, yeah.
So,
Okay. But let me just say, Mark, I can't unmute, I can't identify, but I just want to say that in making the video, I collaborated with my granddaughter, and I mean, I knew she could do it, and she's a major in communications at the University of Missouri, and it was just great fun. Not only did she do it, but she improved upon it a great deal. I'll give you an example. Oh,
there's Jonathan.
Jonathan, so I was able to unmute Jonathan. Jonathan, no pressure if you don't want to. I'd love to greet you and
you can say hi.
yeah, we don't see you, but we hear you.
Oh, it's unmuted. Hi, Grandma.
We got it.
Oh, there they are.
okay.
Not picture,
Selfie's on, Mom.
just not the video. But hi, Grandma.
Hi, sweetie. Did you see the video of yourself banging the pots?
Glorious. It was great.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah, I don't know who else is here, so I'll just say hello to everyone.
Okay. All right, Rachel, I think we try to wrap these 12:20 or so, correct?
Yeah. There's never enough time.
There isn't, but Myrna, thank you so much, not just for doing this, but for the contributions you've made to this community over the years. It's really, really something. And I'm glad we brought the writing project up at the end, because I think a lot of us are sitting here and thinking, what are we going to have at the end of this period of time to hold on to? And it is a moment, really, whatever your project is, to try and turn what is a negative into a positive. And it's impressive that you're continuing to do that.
Actually, a couple of years ago, I think maybe when I published it, I think I suggested that maybe there were I knew there were other people also working on a biography or autobiography. And I suggested that we meet. We did actually meet, and there may be interest again that we could meet on Zoom, or when all this is over in person. I mean, I could share. I could just share what I did in the way of research. People are interested, and there also are other people I know in the community who have done it or are working on it. So
yeah, it's a good idea.
It's a nice thing to do, just to share with your family, because they don't really know an awful lot about where you come from.
Great. Well, thank you, Myrna, and Rachel, and Audrey Lyon, who is the behind-the-scenes manager of this project. I know you're out there somewhere, Audrey, so
yeah.
Thank you very much for involving me. Jeff had his special treatment, so that's how he got on, but thanks for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure.